Fat bride is rejected by her groom. A millionaire sees it and rewards her in an unimaginable way. After judging a book by its cover, this groom will regret his decision forever. Karen took one last look in the mirror, her fingers trembling as they adjusted the delicate lace of her veil. The wedding dress hugged her curves, curves she had spent months agonizing over, curves that Dennis had occasionally commented on with a thin smile that never quite reached his eyes. But today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be perfect. She inhaled deeply, trying to calm the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," her mother said, though her eyes held a shadow of concern. Margaret Walsh had always been protective of her daughter, perhaps too much so. She stepped forward now, adjusting a loose strand of Karen's chestnut hair. "Mom, I'm so nervous," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant murmur of guests filling the church. Margaret hesitated, her hands stilling against the satin fabric of the gown. "Karen, are you absolutely certain about Dennis? There's something about the way he looks at you sometimes." "Mom, please," Karen interrupted, forcing a smile. "Dennis loves me. He's told me so many times." Yet even as she spoke, a sliver of doubt wormed its way into her heart. It was true that Dennis could be critical, that his compliments often came wrapped in suggestions for improvement, but she loved him. And today, in this dress, with her hair and makeup professionally done, surely she would be enough. "It's just that," her mother began again, but a knock at the door interrupted her. "5 minutes," called the wedding coordinator, her voice chipper and professional. Karen took one final look in the mirror. This was it, the beginning of her happily ever after. "I'm ready," she said, more to herself than to her mother. But she wasn't ready. Not for what was about to happen. The doors of the church opened, and the familiar strains of the wedding march filled the air. Karen stepped forward, her arm linked with her father's. The guests rose, turning to face her, and that's when she first noticed something was wrong. There were whispers, too many for a normal wedding procession. Some people were covering their mouths, eyes wide. Others were nudging each other, barely containing smirks. Her pace faltered. Her father squeezed her arm reassuringly, but his face had gone rigid. And then she saw Dennis. He stood at the altar, tall and handsome in his tailored suit, but his face wasn't filled with love or anticipation. Instead, his expression shifted from shock to disgust, his lip curling as his eyes traveled down her dress, taking in every inch of her body like it was something offensive. The walk down the aisle seemed endless, each step heavier than the last. By the time she reached the altar, the whispers had grown louder and Dennis had taken a visible step backward, as if he couldn't bear to be near her. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Dennis's eyes hardened. He looked past her to the assembled guests, then back at her, his voice cold and clear. "I can't do this." The church fell silent. "What?" Karen breathed, certain she had misheard. "Look at you," Dennis said, his voice rising, a cruel edge sharpening his words. "Did you really think I would marry someone who looks like you? This was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But I won't ruin my life by tying myself to this." He gestured dismissively at her body. The world seemed to tilt beneath Karen's feet. She heard her mother's gasp, felt her father's grip tighten on her arm. But all she could focus on was Dennis's face, the contempt in his eyes, and the ripple of shocked whispers spreading through the church. Somewhere someone laughed, a short, sharp sound quickly stifled. "You should leave," Dennis said, straightening his tie as if discussing a minor business inconvenience. "This is embarrassing enough already." Karen stood frozen, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her hands. Shame burned through her, hot and suffocating. The dress that had made her feel beautiful just minutes ago now felt like a costume, a pathetic attempt to be something she wasn't. She began, but the words died in her throat. What could she possibly say? Without conscious thought, she turned. The faces of the guests blurred through her tears, some shocked, some pitying, some barely hiding their amusement. Her mother stood, arms outstretched, but Karen couldn't bear her sympathy. Not now. She gathered the heavy skirts of her wedding dress and ran, the carefully arranged flowers falling from her hands, petals scattering across the polished floor like broken promises. Outside, the sky had darkened, and fat raindrops began to fall, soaking through the delicate fabric of her gown. She didn't care. The cold rainwater mixed with her tears felt appropriate somehow, nature itself washing away the humiliation of this day. She yanked off her veil and let it drop to the wet pavement, a sodden heap of tulle and lace. Her carefully styled hair fell around her face in damp strands as she stumbled forward, not knowing where to go but needing to be anywhere but here. "Miss, wait, please." The voice cut through the sound of the rain, deep and commanding. Karen turned, blinking through tears and raindrops, half expecting to see a church official, or perhaps one of the kinder wedding guests coming to offer hollow comfort. Instead, she saw a stranger, a tall man in an expensive suit that was rapidly becoming soaked in the downpour. He stood at a respectful distance, his dark eyes intent and surprisingly kind. "Who are you?" Karen asked, her voice cracking. "My name is Richard Harrington," he answered, stepping closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. "I was passing by when I saw you run out. Are you all right?" A laugh escaped her, sharp and bitter. "Do I look all right?" He didn't smile at her sarcasm. Instead, his gaze was steady, evaluating but not judging. "No, you don't, and that's understandable." Karen wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how she must look. Mascara streaming down her face, her expensive dress clung to her body, heavy with rain. "If you're here out of pity, please don't. I've had enough humiliation for one day." "Pity," Richard repeated, his eyebrow lifting slightly. "No, I don't pity you. I'm angry on your behalf. No one deserves to be treated that way." Karen stared at him, trying to decipher his expression, to find the lie in his words, but his gaze remained steady, sincere. "You don't even know what happened," she said quietly. "I know enough," he replied. "I know that a man who would publicly humiliate someone he promised to love is not worth a single one of your tears." The simple statement, delivered without drama or condescension, broke through something in Karen. A sob escaped her, and then another, until she was crying openly. Years of insecurity, and the fresh wound of Dennis's rejection pouring out of her in the middle of the rain-soaked street. Richard waited patiently, his presence strangely comforting despite his being a complete stranger. When her sobs finally subsided, he spoke again. "My car is just around the corner. Let me drive you home, or wherever you need to go. You shouldn't be alone right now." Karen hesitated. Getting into a car with a stranger went against everything she'd ever been taught. But something in his steady gaze, in the careful distance he maintained, despite his offer of help, made her trust him. "Okay," she said finally, her voice small but steady. "Thank you." As they walked toward his car, a sleek, black luxury, vehicle that confirmed her suspicion that this man was no ordinary passerby, Karen had no way of knowing that this moment, this chance encounter with a stranger on the worst day of her life, would be the beginning of an extraordinary transformation. The rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of her failed wedding day, but also cleansing her spirit, preparing her for what was to come. Behind them, the church doors remained closed. Inside, a confused minister addressed the stunned guests. Dennis stood at the altar, his initial satisfaction at his dramatic rejection already fading as whispers of disapproval spread through the guests. But Karen didn't see any of this. She was already moving forward, one hesitant step at a time toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. Richard's car was warm and smelled of expensive leather. He handed her a soft, dry blanket from the back seat, which she gratefully wrapped around her shoulders, covering the wedding dress she now despised. "Where can I take you?" he asked, his voice gentle but businesslike. Karen stared out the rain-streaked window, reality setting in. Where could she go? The apartment she had shared with Dennis was filled with her things, but she couldn't bear to return there now. Her parents' home was another option, but the thought of facing her mother's pity and her father's rage was overwhelming. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. Richard nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable answer. "There's a hotel not far from here, Clean, discreet, excellent service. You could stay there tonight, gather your thoughts. I don't have my purse, my credit cards. Everything is at the church or at his apartment. The word home stuck in her throat. I'll take care of it, Richard said simply. When she opened her mouth to protest, he held up a hand. Consider it a loan, if that makes you more comfortable. You can repay me when you're back on your feet. Karen studied his profile as he drove through the rain-slicked streets. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with dark hair graying slightly at the temples, and a face that spoke of experience rather than conventional handsomeness. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy despite the circumstances of their meeting. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the road. "Let's just say I recognize undeserved cruelty when I see it, and I believe in fighting injustice even in small ways." There was something in his tone, a hint of personal experience perhaps, that made Karen hold back the other questions burning in her mind. Instead, she leaned back against the leather seat, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. "Thank you," she said simply. Richard nodded, and they drove the rest of the way in silence. The hotel was exactly as Richard had described, elegant without being ostentatious, with a discreet staff who barely blinked at the sight of a woman in a rain-soaked wedding dress. Richard spoke quietly to the manager, who nodded and quickly processed a room key without asking for identification or credit card information. Karen realized that Richard must be a regular or important client, and her curiosity about him grew. "The room is booked for a week," Richard told her, handing her the key card. "That should give you some time to figure out your next steps. There's also a credit at the hotel for meals and necessities." "I can't accept all this," Karen protested weakly, though the reality of her situation made her arguments hollow. "You can, and you should," Richard replied firmly. "Everyone needs help sometimes. The measure of a person isn't whether they need assistance, but what they do with it afterward." He handed her a business card, simple and elegant, with just his name and a phone number. "Call me when you're ready to talk. No pressure, no obligations, but I believe I might be able to offer you more than just temporary shelter." Karen took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. "What do you mean?" Richard smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his serious face, making him look younger, more approachable. "Let's just say I have a proposition for you. A business proposition," he clarified. "But that's a conversation for another day, when you've had time to rest and recover." He stepped back, maintaining the respectful distance he'd kept since their first encounter. "Take care of yourself, Karen, and remember, what happened today was a reflection of his character, not your worth." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing in the tasteful lobby, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. Grief, humiliation, and confusion, yes, but also sparked by this unexpected encounter, the faintest flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity about what might come next. As she made her way to her room, still wrapped in the blanket from Richard's car, Karen had no idea that this stranger's appearance in her life would lead to a transformation beyond anything she could imagine. She only knew that, for the first time since Dennis had rejected her at the altar, she was thinking about tomorrow. The hotel room was tastefully decorated in soothing shades of blue and cream, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil still raging inside Karen. She stood in the center of the room, the ruined wedding dress heavy and cold against her skin, feeling utterly disconnected from her surroundings. Mechanically, she unzipped the dress and stepped out of it, leaving it in a sodden heap on the marble bathroom floor. She stood under the hot shower until her skin was pink and her tears had finally stopped flowing, then wrapped herself in the plush hotel robe. Sitting on the edge of the king-sized bed, Karen's mind replayed the events of the day in excruciating detail. Dennis's face twisted with disgust, the whispers and stifled laughter of the guests, her desperate flight from the church. And then, the strange encounter with Richard Harrington. She picked up his business card from the nightstand, running her fingers over the embossed lettering. There was no company name, no title, only his name and a phone number. Who was he? A passing good Samaritan with unusually deep pockets, or something else? Her curiosity was interrupted by a knock at the door. Clutching the robe tighter around herself, she peered through the peephole to see a hotel staff member with a garment bag and a small suitcase. "Delivery for Ms. Walsh," the young woman announced when Karen opened the door slightly. Confused, Karen accepted the items. Inside the garment bag, she found 3 simple but elegant outfits in her size, along with appropriate undergarments. The suitcase contained toiletries, sleepwear, and other necessities. A small note was attached to the garment bag. "Thought you might need these. No wedding dress should be worn on its worst day only. Rach." Karen sat heavily on the bed, overwhelmed by this further kindness from a stranger. How had he known her sizes? How had he arranged this so quickly? And why was he going to such lengths for someone he'd just met? She should be suspicious, she knew. But after the cruel betrayal by the man she'd trusted most, there was something healing about this unexpected generosity, with no apparent strings attached. Her phone, which had been silent since she'd silenced it before the ceremony, suddenly lit up with notifications. Dozens of missed calls and messages from her parents, from friends, even a few hesitant texts from bridesmaids who had stood by silently during her humiliation. Karen turned the phone off without reading any of them. She couldn't face their pity or questions yet. Instead, she changed into the comfortable sleepwear provided, ordered room service, and for the first time since she'd woken that morning, full of hope and excitement for her wedding day, allowed herself to think about what came next. Her job as an administrative assistant at a local marketing firm had been adequate but uninspiring. She'd been planning to quit after the honeymoon, as Dennis had wanted her to focus on creating a home while he built his career at his father's investment firm. The irony that she was now homeless and unmarried wasn't lost on her. She had some savings, enough to get by for a few months if she was careful. She could find a small apartment, look for a new job, rebuild her life piece by piece. It would be hard, but not impossible. As she ate her dinner and watched the rain continue to fall outside her window, Karen thought about Richard's words. "I have a proposition for you." What kind of proposition could a wealthy stranger have for someone like her? Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive. She lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, her mind cycling between humiliation, grief, and curiosity about the mysterious Richard Harrington. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were a chaotic mix of wedding disasters and dark, reassuring eyes offering help when she least expected it. In the morning, Karen woke to sunshine streaming through the partially open curtains. For one blissful moment, she forgot the events of the previous day. Then reality crashed back, bringing with it a fresh wave of shame and grief. But something was different. The overwhelming paralysis of yesterday had receded, replaced by a dull ache and surprisingly a flicker of anger. How dare Dennis humiliate her like that? How dare he make her feel worthless, as if her body, her very being, was something to be ashamed of? The anger felt good, energizing in a way her grief had not been. She showered and dressed in one of the outfits Richard had sent, simple black pants and a blue blouse that fit her perfectly. Looking at herself in the mirror, Karen made a decision. She would call her parents, assure them she was safe, and then she would call Richard Harrington. Whatever his proposition was, it had to be better than sitting alone in this hotel room, drowning in humiliation and self-pity. Her mother answered on the first ring, her voice frantic with worry. "Karen, where are you? We've been out of our minds." "I'm safe, Mom," Karen said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm at a hotel. I just needed some time alone." "Oh, sweetheart, what he did was unforgivable. Your father wanted to go after him, but we were so worried about you. Please tell us where you are. We'll come get you." Karen closed her eyes, imagining her childhood bedroom, her mother's hovering concern, her father's impotent rage. It would be comforting, but also suffocating. "Not yet," she said gently. "I need a little more time, but I promise I'm okay and I'll be in touch soon." It took several more minutes to convince her mother that she was truly all right, and to extract a promise that her father wouldn't do anything rash. By the time she hung up, Karen felt drained but resolute. She picked up Richard's card and dialed the number before she could lose her nerve. He answered immediately, his deep voice instantly recognizable. Richard Harrington. It's Karen Walsh. From yesterday, she added unnecessarily. Karen, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I'm glad you called. How are you feeling today? Better, she said, surprised to find it was true. Thank you for the clothes and everything else. It was incredibly kind. It was. The least I could do. Have you had breakfast? There's a cafe not far from your hotel that makes excellent pastries. I could meet you there in an hour if you're ready to talk. Karen hesitated only briefly. Yes, I'd like that. He gave her the address and simple directions, then added, And Karen, I'm looking forward to our conversation. As she hung up, Karen felt a strange mix of nervousness and anticipation. She didn't know what Richard's proposition might be, but for the first time since Dennis had rejected her at the altar, she was looking forward rather than back. The E. Cafe was a charming place with outdoor seating shaded by large umbrellas. Richard was already there when she arrived, reading something on a tablet. He stood as she approached, his smile warm but respectful. You look much better today, he said, pulling out a chair for her. Karen returned his smile hesitantly. Amazing what dry clothes and a good night's sleep can do, even after the worst day of your life. Richard's expression sobered. I can only imagine. I'm sorry for what you went through, Karen. A server appeared with coffee and a selection of pastries that Richard must have ordered in advance. As they prepared their coffee, Richard taking his black, Karen adding cream to hers, she studied him more carefully than she had been able to the day before. In daylight, Richard Harrington was even more impressive. His tailored suit spoke of wealth and taste, his confident posture of authority and self-assurance. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 40s, with streaks of silver at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and stress. He was not conventionally handsome like Dennis, but there was something compelling about his face, a strength and intelligence that drew the eye. So, she said finally, after taking a fortifying sip of excellent coffee, you mentioned a proposition yesterday. Richard nodded, setting down his cup. I did, but before we get to that, I'd like to know a bit more about you, Karen. What were you doing before yesterday? Karen hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. Her career seemed so insignificant compared to whatever Richard did to afford his obvious wealth. I was an administrative assistant at Hayes Marketing, nothing very exciting. And did you enjoy it? The question surprised her. Dennis had never asked if she enjoyed her work. He'd only complained when it interfered with his plans or needs. Parts of it, she admitted. I'm good with details and organization, and I liked helping the creative team prepare presentations, finding just the right images or data to strengthen their concepts. Richard nodded thoughtfully. You have an eye for what works, what resonates. It wasn't a question, but Karen nodded anyway, strangely pleased by his assessment. And what about your own ambitions? What would you do if there were no limitations? Karen stared at him. No one had asked her about her ambitions in a long time. Dennis had made it clear that his career was the priority in their relationship. Her job was merely a placeholder until she became his wife and, eventually, the mother of his children. I'm not sure, she said honestly. I used to want to be in publishing, helping to shape stories, bringing important ideas to the world. But that seems like a different lifetime now. Richard leaned forward, his dark eyes intent. It doesn't have to be. Karen, I've been watching you since you sat down. You carry yourself with natural dignity, even after what happened yesterday. You're articulate, observant, and from what I can tell, underestimated by everyone in your life, possibly including yourself. Karen felt her cheeks warm at his assessment. You can't possibly know all that from one conversation. I've built my career on reading people correctly, Richard replied. And I'm rarely wrong. He paused, taking another sip of his coffee. Which brings me to my proposition. I own Harrington Media Group. We have publishing interests, yes, but also digital, media, television, and consulting services. I'm looking for someone to join my executive team as a project coordinator, someone with an eye for detail, but also a sense of what connects with people. Karen blinked, certain she had misunderstood. You're offering me a job? But you don't know anything about my qualifications. I know enough, Richard said simply. The rest you can learn. What I can't teach is character and intuition, and you have both. But why me? Why someone you literally found crying in the street? Richard's expression softened slightly. Let's just say I have a history of finding diamonds in unexpected places. People who, for whatever reason, haven't been given the opportunity to shine. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. I won't lie to you, Karen. The job wouldn't be easy. It would require long hours, a steep learning curve, and dealing with high-pressure situations. But the compensation would be excellent. And more importantly, it would be a chance to reinvent yourself on your own terms. Karen sat back, overwhelmed. It seemed too good to be true. A dream job appearing out of nowhere at her lowest moment. There had to be a catch. What would you expect from me in return? She asked cautiously. Richard's eyebrow rose slightly. Hard work, loyalty, and discretion. Nothing more. The waiter returned to refill their coffee cups, giving Karen a moment to gather her thoughts. This was all happening so fast. Yesterday she'd been about to marry Dennis to become the wife of a successful investment banker. Today she was considering a job offer from a media mogul she'd met in the rain. I need time to think, she said. Finally. Richard nodded, unsurprised. Of course, take the rest of the week. The hotel is paid for and you have no obligations. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table to her. Here's more information about the position, the company, and what would be expected of you. Review it. And if you have questions, call me any time. Karen accepted the folder, her mind racing with possibilities and doubts. And if I say no, then I wish you well and the hotel and clothing remain a gift, no strings attached. His expression was calm, with no hint of pressure or disappointment. This isn't charity, Karen. It's an opportunity I believe would benefit us both. But the choice is entirely yours. As they finished their coffee, the conversation turned to lighter topics, books they had read, cities they had visited. Karen found herself relaxing, even laughing once or twice at Richard's dry observations. He was intelligent and well-read, but not in the showy way Dennis had been, always dropping names and references to impress others. When they finally parted, Richard shook her hand firmly. Whatever you decide, Karen, remember this. What happened yesterday doesn't define you. How you respond to it might. Walking back to her hotel, the folder tucked securely under her arm, Karen felt a strange sense of lightness. The hurt and humiliation of Dennis's rejection hadn't disappeared, but they had been joined by something new. Possibility. In her hotel room, Karen spread the contents of Richard's folder across the bed. There was a detailed job description. That made her both excited and intimidated. Information about Harrington Media Group, which was even larger and more prestigious than she had realized, and a compensation package that made her eyes widen. The salary alone was 3 times what she'd been making at Hayes Marketing, not to mention the benefits, potential bonuses, and stock options. It seemed like a fantasy, a fairy tale rescue too perfect to be real, and yet Richard himself had seemed genuine. There had been no hint of deception in his manner, no suggestion of ulterior motives in his offer. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from her mother, asking again when she would come home. Another message appeared beneath it. This, one from Dennis. Her heart jumped painfully at the sight of his name. We need to talk. What happened was unfortunate. Call me. Unfortunate. As if he had spilled wine on her dress rather than publicly rejected and humiliated her. The casual cruelty of his message crystallized something in Karen's mind. Going back to her parents' house, to her old job, to any version of her former life where she might have to face Dennis or the pity of those who had witnessed her humiliation, was unthinkable. She picked up her phone and typed a brief message to Richard. I accept your offer. When do I start? His reply came almost immediately. Monday, 8 a.m. I'll send a car. Bring only what you need for the day. We'll sort out the rest. Welcome to Harrington Media Group, Karen. As she set the phone down, Karen felt a surge of emotions, fear, excitement, and beneath it all, a growing determination. This was her chance to rebuild, to become someone new, someone stronger, someone who would never again believe she wasn't enough. For the next 3 days, Karen allowed herself the luxury of preparation and recovery. She spoke with her parents, assuring them she was safe and had a new job opportunity she was pursuing. She arranged for her mother to collect some of her belongings from the apartment she had shared with Dennis, sparing herself that painful encounter. She did not return Dennis's message. She read everything she could find about Harrington Media Group and Richard himself. The company was indeed impressive, rapidly growing media conglomerate with a reputation for innovation and excellence. Richard was more difficult to research. He seemed to deliberately maintain a low profile despite his success, with few interviews or public appearances. What she did find portrayed him as brilliant but demanding, respected rather than liked by his peers in the industry. By Monday morning, as she dressed in her most professional outfit from the clothes Richard had provided, Karen felt a curious mix of terror and exhilaration. She hadn't felt this alive in years, perhaps ever. Whatever happened next, whether Richard's offer proved to be the opportunity of a lifetime or a terrible mistake, it was her choice, her path forward. When the sleek company car arrived to collect her, Karen was ready. She stepped into the vehicle without looking back, leaving behind the remnants of her old life and moving toward whatever awaited her at Harrington Media Group. The Harrington Media Group headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of the city's business district. As the elevator whisked Karen to the 50th floor, her stomach fluttered with nerves. What if she couldn't handle this job? What if Richard had overestimated her abilities? What if everyone saw through her, recognized her as the pathetic, rejected bride from just a week ago? The elevator doors opened onto a sophisticated reception area, all steel and glass with splashes of rich blue, the company's signature color. A poised receptionist looked up with a professional smile. "Ms. Walsh, Mr. Harrington is expecting you. Follow me, please." Karen was led through an open workspace where dozens of well-dressed professionals worked at sleek computer stations or gathered in glass-walled meeting rooms. No one paid her much attention, which was both reassuring and intimidating. Richard's corner office offered a panoramic view of the city. He rose from behind an impressive desk when she entered, his smile genuine but restrained. "Karen, welcome. How are you feeling?" "Nervous," she admitted, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. "But ready." He nodded approvingly. "Good. Nerves keep us sharp." He gestured to a woman who had been sitting quietly in one of the visitor chairs. "This is Sophia Chen, our HR director. She'll get you set up with all the necessary paperwork and credentials, then give you a tour of the facilities. I've scheduled a proper briefing for this afternoon, once you've had a chance to get oriented." Sophia stood, offering her hand. She was a striking woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Karen. Richard has told me a lot about your potential." The morning passed in a blur of paperwork, introductions, and information. Sophia was efficient but kind, answering Karen's questions patiently and offering insights into the company culture and Richard's management style. "He's demanding," Sophia said frankly as they ate lunch in the company cafeteria. "He expects excellence and has little patience for excuses. But he's also fair and he rewards loyalty and hard work generously. The fact that he specifically recruited you is unusual. He must see something special in you." Karen shifted uncomfortably, wondering how much Sophia knew about the circumstances of her meeting with Richard. "He took a chance on me. I don't want to let him down." Sophia studied her thoughtfully. "Just be yourself, Karen. Richard has an uncanny ability to match people to the right roles. Trust his judgment and trust yourself." By the time Karen returned to Richard's office for her afternoon briefing, her head was spinning with names, procedures, and expectations. Richard was not alone. A striking man with close-cropped silver hair and piercing blue eyes stood examining a large wall display of what appeared to be analytics data. "Karen, this is Marcus Everett, our Chief Strategy Officer," Richard introduced them. "Marcus Karen Walsh, our new project coordinator." Marcus turned, his appraising gaze taking in every detail of Karen's appearance in a way that made her instantly self-conscious. Unlike Richard's evaluating looks, which had seemed respectful and professional, Marcus's scrutiny felt invasive, almost predatory. "So this is your latest discovery," Marcus said, his tone making the word sound vaguely insulting. He extended his hand to Karen, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Welcome to Harrington Media. I'm sure you'll find it educational." Karen shook his hand, determined not to show discomfort. "Thank you. I'm looking forward to learning all I can." Marcus's smile tightened slightly and he turned back to Richard. "We'll finish our discussion later. I'm still not convinced this rebranding strategy is worth the investment." After he left, Richard gestured for Karen to sit. "Don't mind Marcus. He's brilliant but distrusts anything that isn't his own idea. You'll get used to him." Karen wasn't so sure, but she nodded anyway. "Sophia mentioned I'd be working on a special project to start." Richard turned to his computer, pulling up a series of documents and presentations. "Yes. We've recently acquired a struggling lifestyle magazine called Gleam. It has potential, but its current direction is unfocused and outdated. I want you to help reimagine it. New visual identity, editorial focus, digital presence. You'll be working with a team, of course, but I want you to lead the project." Karen stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Lead? But I just got here. I don't have any experience in publishing or team management." "Which is precisely why I want your perspective," Richard countered. "You're our target demographic, and you have fresh eyes. You'll see opportunities that industry veterans might miss. And don't worry, you'll have support. Diana Ross from editorial will be your right hand, and you can pull in resources from art, digital, and marketing as needed." It was overwhelming, terrifying, and thrilling all at once. Karen wanted to protest that she wasn't ready, that he was overestimating her capabilities, but the confidence in Richard's eyes stopped her. He believed she could do this. Maybe it was time she started believing it too. "When do I start?" she asked instead. Richard's smile was approving. "Tomorrow morning. You'll meet your team at 9 a.m. For now, take these materials home and start familiarizing yourself with the brand. And Karen?" He paused, his expression serious. "This is your opportunity to prove to yourself what you're capable of. I chose you for a reason. Don't be afraid to trust your instincts." The next few weeks were the most challenging of Karen's life. She worked longer hours than she ever had before, learning the intricacies of publishing, marketing, and digital media on the fly, while trying to lead a team of experienced professionals who were initially skeptical of her sudden appointment. Diana Ross, the editorial director assigned to work with her, was particularly frosty at first. A veteran journalist in her 40s, with impeccable credentials and a no-nonsense attitude, she made it clear she thought Karen was out of her depth. "So you have no publishing experience, no management experience, and no formal qualifications beyond an associate's degree," Diana summarized during their first meeting, glancing through Karen's personnel file. "Yet Richard has put you in charge of reinventing a magazine that's been around for 20 years. Interesting." Karen fought to keep her expression neutral, though she felt her cheeks burning. "I understand your concerns. I'd have them too in your position. But I'm a fast learner and I respect your expertise. I'm hoping we can collaborate rather than compete." Diana's eyebrow rose slightly, perhaps surprised by Karen's candor. "Fair enough. Let's see what you've got." The first team meeting was even more intimidating. Gathered around the conference table were 8 professionals, all with years of experience in their respective fields, all watching Karen with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Karen had spent most of the night reviewing the materials Richard had given her, forcing herself to look past her insecurities and focus on the task at hand. Now standing before the team, she took a deep breath and began. "I know what you're all thinking," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Who is this woman, and why is she leading this project?" The honest answer is that I'm asking myself the same question. I don't have your experience or industry knowledge. What I do have is a fresh perspective and Mr. Harrington's confidence. So I'm going to propose something unconventional. Let's approach this magazine not as industry experts, trying to fix a broken product, but as potential readers asking ourselves what would make us pick it up in the first place. She turned to the large screen behind her, displaying the current cover of Gleam magazine. a glossy, generic image of a celebrity with headlines promising miracle diets and relationship secrets. When I look at this, I see a magazine that's trying to be everything to everyone and in the process connecting with no one. What if we narrowed our focus? Instead of another general lifestyle magazine, what if Gleam became the first mainstream publication dedicated to celebrating women of all sizes, backgrounds, and abilities? The room was silent. Karen's heart pounded in her chest. Had she overstepped, made a fool of herself on her very first day? Then Diana leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "You're suggesting a complete repositioning of the brand. That's a massive undertaking." "It is," Karen agreed, "but from what I've seen, continuing on the current path isn't an option if we want this magazine to survive. And there's a huge underserved market out there of women who don't see themselves reflected in traditional media." Slowly, the discussion gained momentum. Ideas were proposed, challenged, refined. By the end of the meeting, even the most skeptical team members were engaged in the conversation, and Karen caught a glimmer of respect in Diana's eyes. As the weeks passed, Karen threw herself into the project with a single-minded determination that surprised even herself. She worked 18-hour days, absorbed information like a sponge, and slowly earned the respect of her team through her unwavering commitment and willingness to listen. Richard checked in regularly, but gave her space to find her footing. "You're doing well," he told her after reviewing their progress 1 month in. "The team is responding to your leadership." "Some days I still feel like an imposter," Karen admitted, "like everyone's just waiting for me to fail." "That feeling never entirely goes away," Richard said, surprising her. "Even I have moments of doubt. The difference is in whether you let that doubt paralyze you or motivate you." Marcus Everett remained a challenge. He seemed to appear at Karen's most vulnerable moments, offering criticism thinly veiled as advice, questioning her decisions in management meetings, and generally making it clear he thought Richard had made a mistake in hiring her. "He sees you as a threat," Diana told her one evening as they worked late, finalizing the content strategy for the relaunched magazine. Karen laughed in disbelief. "Me? A threat to Marcus Everett? That's ridiculous." Diana shook her head. "Not to him personally, to his influence over Richard. Marcus has been Richard's right hand for years. He's not used to sharing that position, especially not with a newcomer Richard clearly values." The observation gave Karen pause. Did Richard truly value her that much? He'd certainly given her an extraordinary opportunity, but she'd assumed it was a one-time act of kindness, not an indication of ongoing confidence. As the relaunch date for Gleam approached, Karen's confidence grew alongside her abilities. The magazine was transforming under her guidance, with a bold new visual identity, content that was both aspirational and authentic, and a digital strategy, designed to build a community rather than just attract readers. There were setbacks, of course. Some advertisers balked at the new direction, uncomfortable with a magazine that celebrated women who didn't conform to traditional beauty standards. A key staff writer quit, claiming the publication was lowering its standards. And Marcus continued, his subtle campaign of undermining Karen's authority whenever possible. But Karen persevered, drawing strength from the growing enthusiasm of her team and Richard's steady support. The woman who had run from a church in tears just months earlier was disappearing, replaced by someone more confident, more resilient, and infinitely more self-assured. Then, 6 weeks before the relaunch, disaster struck. Karen was presenting the final concept to the executive team when Marcus interrupted with devastating news. "While this is all very heartwarming," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I feel obligated to point out that Elegant Media has just announced their own body-positive publication, scheduled to launch next month. They've secured exclusive contracts with 3 of the influencers you were planning to feature, and their advertising rates are deliberately undercut to steal our potential sponsors." The room fell silent. Karen felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Their entire strategy was based on being first to market with this concept. Being perceived as followers rather than leaders would doom the relaunch before it began. "How did they know?" Diana asked, her voice tight with anger. "Our plans were confidential." Marcus spread his hands in a gesture of innocent concern. "Perhaps someone was indiscreet, or perhaps great minds think alike. Either way, we need to reconsider this entire approach. I suggest we revert to a more traditional concept. No, Karen interrupted, surprising herself as much as everyone else in the room. All eyes turned to her, including Richard's, his expression unreadable. No, she repeated more firmly. We don't change course, we accelerate. That's not possible, Marcus objected. The timeline can be compressed, Karen insisted. We move the launch up by 3 weeks, beating them to market. We pivot from the influencers we've lost to new voices who are even more authentic and compelling, and we make our point of difference crystal clear. While they're jumping on a trend, we're starting a movement. Richard leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Explain. Karen moved to the whiteboard, her mind racing ahead of her words. Elegant Media is a conglomerate with dozens of publications. This new magazine will be just another product in their lineup. But for us, this is a radical reinvention, a statement of values. We don't just show diverse women on our cover, we ensure they're represented in our staff, our contributors, our business partners. We don't just talk about inclusion, we build it into our DNA. She turned to face the room, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Yes, they might beat us to the surface-level concept, but they can't match our authenticity or commitment if we're bold enough to go all in. The room was silent as everyone looked to Richard for his reaction. He studied Karen thoughtfully, then nodded once, decisively. Make it happen, he said simply. Whatever resources you need are yours. Marcus, arrange an emergency meeting with the marketing team. Diana, start reaching out to alternative contributors immediately. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Karen, a word in my office, please. As they walked together down the hallway, Karen braced herself for criticism. Perhaps she had overstepped, challenged Marcus too publicly. But when Richard's office door closed behind them, he turned to her with a smile that transformed his serious face. That, he said, is exactly why I hired you. Karen blinked in surprise. You're not angry. Why would I be? You showed leadership, strategic thinking, and the courage to stand your ground. 3 months ago, would you have done that? Challenged someone like Marcus in a room full of executives? Karen didn't have to consider her answer. No, never. And that, Richard said, quietly, is the transformation I hope to see. Not just in Gleam magazine, but in you. For the first time since their strange first meeting in the rain, Karen truly understood what Richard had seen in her that day. Not just someone to be rescued, but someone with untapped potential waiting to be unleashed. The following 3 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The entire team worked around the clock to revise timelines, adapt strategies, and prepare for an accelerated launch. Karen barely slept, running on adrenaline and determination, her focus absolute, and through it all she was changing. The woman who had once defined herself through Dennis's eyes was gone, replaced by someone who stood straight, spoke clearly, and faced challenges head-on. Even her appearance reflected this transformation, not through any dramatic makeover, but through the quiet confidence that now infused her posture, her expressions, her choices. One evening, as she worked late in her office, Diana appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. You need to pace yourself, she said, placing 1 cup on Karen's desk. The human body wasn't designed to run on stress and caffeine indefinitely. Karen smiled wearily, accepting the coffee with gratitude. Just a few more days until the launch. I can sleep afterward. Diana sat in the visitor's chair, studying Karen with a mixture of concern and admiration. You know, when Richard first introduced you as our new project leader, I was furious. I thought you were just another of his charity cases, someone he was helping out for personal reasons. Charity cases? Karen repeated, startled. Diana nodded. Richard has a habit of finding talented people in unlikely circumstances and giving them chances others wouldn't. His executive assistant was a barista at a coffee shop he frequented. His head of digital strategy was a college dropout working retail. He sees potential where others don't. She paused. But even by those standards, your rise has been remarkable. Karen absorbed this information slowly. She had known, of course, That Richard's interest in her was unusual, but she hadn't realized it was part of a pattern. It was both reassuring and slightly deflating. Had she been special to him at all, or just another project? "I was wrong about you," Diana continued, oblivious to Karen's thoughts. "You've earned your place here regardless of how you got it, and for what it's worth, I think your ex-fiancé was an idiot." Karen nearly choked on her coffee. "You know about that?" Diana shrugged. "Office gossip, don't worry. Most people don't know the details. Just that you went through something difficult before coming here." Karen set down her cup, suddenly needing to know. "And Richard? Did he tell people about how we met?" "Richard?" Diana laughed. "He never discusses his personal business, or anyone else's. All he ever said was that he'd found someone with exceptional potential for the Gleam project." She stood, gathering her things. "Get some rest, Karen. Tomorrow's another big day." After Diana left, Karen sat in the quiet of her office, thinking about Richard, about Dennis, about the strange journey that had brought her here. The humiliation of her wedding day no longer stung as sharply. It had become part of her story, but no longer defined her. She wondered briefly what Dennis was doing now, whether he ever regretted his cruel rejection. But the thought didn't linger. Dennis belonged to her past. Her future, uncertain, challenging, but full of possibility, lay ahead. The morning of the relaunch arrived with a flurry of last-minute details and unexpected challenges. The website crashed briefly during final testing. A key interview arrived late from the transcriber. The special edition print copies for the launch party were delayed at the printer. But Karen handled each crisis with a calm efficiency that inspired her team. By 6 o'clock that evening, everything was ready. The newly reimagined Gleam magazine would go live online at midnight, with print copies hitting newsstands the following morning. The launch party at a trendy downtown hotel would unveil the new brand to media, advertisers and influencers in just 2 hours. Karen stood in the office bathroom, applying a final touch of lipstick and studying her reflection. The woman who looked back at her was almost a stranger, confident, polished, with a quiet strength in her eyes that had never been there before. She wore a sophisticated blue dress that complemented her curves rather than trying to hide them, embodying the very message of body positivity that the new Gleam championed. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Richard, immaculate in a tailored suit, his eyes warm with approval as he took in her appearance. "Ready for your big night?" he asked. Karen took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." As they rode the elevator down together, Richard seemed unusually thoughtful. "Whatever happens tonight," he said finally, "I want you to know that you've already succeeded. What you've accomplished in 3 months would have taken most people years. You should be proud." Something in his tone made Karen glance at him sharply. "How you make it sound like a farewell speech." Richard smiled slightly. "Not a farewell, but perhaps the end of one chapter and the beginning of another." Before she could question him further, the elevator doors opened and they stepped out into the lobby, where other members of the team were waiting to travel to the venue together. The moment for private conversation had passed. The hotel ballroom was transformed for the launch event, with large displays featuring the new Gleam branding and covers. Servers circulated with champagne and canapes. A diverse group of models showcased clothing from brands that had partnered with the magazine, all designed to flatter a range of body types. As guests began to arrive, Karen stood with Richard, Diana, and other key team members, greeting media representatives and potential advertisers. She was surprised by how natural it felt, this role that would have terrified her just months ago. "Quite a transformation," a familiar voice remarked behind her. Karen turned to find Marcus Everett, impeccably dressed and wearing an expression of grudging respect. "Both the magazine and you." "Thank you, Marcus," Karen replied, choosing to take his words at face value rather than searching for the hidden barb. "Your input was valuable throughout the process." His eyebrow lifted slightly at her diplomatic response. "Indeed. Well, the real test begins tomorrow, when we see how the market responds." "I'm confident in our strategy," Karen said simply. And she was, she realized. Whatever happened next, she knew they had created something meaningful. Marcus nodded, then lowered his voice. "Has Richard spoken to you yet? About the new arrangement. Karen frowned. What new arrangement? But before Marcus could answer, Richard appeared at her elbow. Karen, there's someone I'd like you to meet. He guided her away from Marcus toward a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s. This is Eleanor Hayes, editor-in-chief of Hayes Publishing Group. Karen recognized the name immediately. Hayes was one of the most respected independent publishing houses in the country, known for its commitment to quality and innovation. It's an honor to meet you, Ms. Hayes, she said sincerely. Eleanor Hayes had keen eyes that seemed to look right through pretense. The honor is mine. Richard has told me about your work with Gleam. I'm impressed by your vision. As they conversed, Karen gradually realized this wasn't a casual introduction. Eleanor was asking targeted questions about Karen's background, her approach to the Gleam relaunch, her thoughts on the future of publishing. It felt almost like a job interview. When Eleanor excused herself to speak with other guests, Karen turned to Richard questioningly. What was that about? Richard hesitated, then gestured toward a quiet corner of the room. I was planning to discuss this with you tomorrow after the launch, but since Marcus has apparently let the cat out of the bag, he sighed. Eleanor Hayes is looking for a new creative director for her lifestyle division. I recommended you for the position. Karen stared at him, stunned. What? Why? Because you're ready for the next challenge, Richard said simply. Hayes Publishing would offer you a broader platform, more creative control, and honestly, a culture that might better suit your strengths. You're trying to get rid of me? Karen asked, hurt seeping into her voice despite her best efforts. Richard shook his head firmly. No, I'm trying to help you grow. Karen, what you've done with Gleam is remarkable. You could continue in your current role, and you'd be excellent at it, but I see even greater potential in you. Hayes is offering an opportunity I can't match right now. Karen struggled to process this unexpected development. Part of her was flattered that Richard thought her capable of such a prestigious role. Another part felt abandoned, just when she'd found her footing at Harrington Media. I don't understand, she said finally. If you think so highly of my work, why not create a similar position for me here? Richard's expression softened. Because sometimes the best growth happens outside our comfort zones, and because, he hesitated, then continued more quietly, I'm not entirely objective when it comes to you. I think we both know that. Karen's heart skipped a beat. Was Richard suggesting what she thought he was? There had been moments, glances held a beat too long, conversations that flowed into personal territory, a connection that felt deeper than mere professional respect. But she'd dismissed these as her imagination, or as inappropriate wishful thinking. Richard, But the moment was interrupted as Diana appeared, apologetic but insistent. Karen, I'm sorry, but it's time for your speech. Everyone's waiting. With no choice but to follow, Karen made her way to the small stage that had been set up at one end of the ballroom. As she stepped up to the microphone, facing a room full of expectant faces, she felt a momentary flash of panic. Then her eyes found Richard, standing at the back of the room, watching her with quiet confidence. And somehow that was enough. Good evening, she began, her voice clear and steady. 6 months ago, if you had told me I would be standing here, today launching a reimagined version of an iconic magazine, I would have said you were crazy. 6 months ago I was a different person, someone who let others define her worth, someone afraid to take up space in the world. The room had grown quiet, attentive to the personal note in her voice. Gleam magazine was in a similar position. It had lost its way, trying to be what others expected rather than defining its own unique voice. Our journey together, the magazines and mine, has been about finding the courage to be authentic, to challenge expectations and to claim our rightful place without apology. Karen gestured to the displays around the room, showcasing the magazine's new look. The new Gleam celebrates women as they are, not as some impossible ideal. It offers substance along with style, depth along with beauty. It recognizes that our strength often comes from our most challenging moments, and that transformation is always possible. Her eyes found Richard again, and she felt a surge of gratitude for his belief in her, mixed with confusion about what might lie ahead. None of this would have been possible without the vision and support of Richard Harrington, who saw potential where others saw only failure. Sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is someone who believes in us before we believe in ourselves. As she concluded her speech, and the room erupted in applause, Karen felt as if she were standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay the painful memory of Dennis's rejection, the unexpected encounter with Richard, and her transformation from rejected bride to confident executive. Ahead lay new possibilities she hadn't even imagined, perhaps a prestigious position at Hayes Publishing, perhaps something else entirely. The only certainty was that she would face whatever came next on her own terms, defined by her own sense of worth rather than anyone else's judgment. And in that knowledge there was both freedom and power. The launch party continued late into the night, with overwhelmingly positive reactions to the new Gleam concept. Karen moved through the crowd with growing confidence, accepting congratulations and answering questions with poise. By the time the last guests departed, she was exhausted but exhilarated. Richard found her as she was gathering her things, preparing to head home for a few precious hours of sleep before the official online launch at midnight. "That was quite a speech," he said quietly. Karen met his gaze directly. "I meant every word." "I know." He hesitated, then continued. "About Hayes Publishing. There's no pressure for an immediate decision. Take some time to consider all your options." "Including staying at Harrington Media?" Karen asked, needing to understand exactly what he was offering. Richard's expression was complex, a mixture of professional respect and something more personal that he seemed to be holding carefully in check. "That will always be an option, Karen. But I want what's best for your career, even if that means watching you succeed elsewhere." There was so much more to say, so many questions to ask, but this wasn't the time or place. They were both exhausted, emotional from the success of the launch, and surrounded by staff members cleaning up the event space. "I'll think about it," Karen promised, "and we'll talk more tomorrow." Richard nodded, then surprised her by briefly touching her hand, a gesture so small yet somehow intimate. "I'm proud of you, Karen. Whatever you decide next, never forget how far you've come." As Karen left the hotel and stepped into the waiting company car, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. 6 months ago she had stood in the rain, her wedding dress soaked, her heart broken, believing her life was over. Now she had options, opportunities, a future bright with possibility. The car passed through neighborhoods she had once walked with Dennis, past the church where he had publicly humiliated her. But those memories no longer had the power to wound her. They were simply part of the path that had led her here, to this moment of triumph and choice. The driver took a turn that Karen didn't recognize. "This isn't the way to my apartment," she noted, leaning forward. "Mr. Harrington left specific instructions," the driver replied. "We're making a small detour." Curious, Karen settled back in her seat. Minutes later, the car pulled up in front of an elegant apartment building in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. The driver came around to open her door. "Top floor, apartment 1501, he said, handing her a key card. "Everything has been arranged." Bewildered, Karen took the elevator to the 15th floor. The apartment door opened to reveal a stunning space with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city lights. On a table in the entryway sat a small wrapped package and an envelope addressed to her in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Karen opened the envelope first, unfolding the note inside. "Karen, consider this your well-earned victory gift, regardless of what you decide about Hayes Publishing. The apartment is yours. The lease is paid for a year, with an option to purchase if you wish. You once asked me why I helped you that day in the rain. The truth is, I recognized in you something I've spent my life looking for. Not just intelligence or potential, but a genuine spirit that no amount of cruelty or rejection could extinguish. What you've accomplished these past months has proven me right beyond my expectations. Tomorrow we can discuss your future at Harrington Media or elsewhere, but tonight I hope you'll take a moment to celebrate how far you've come and to know with absolute certainty that you were always enough." "With admiration and more, Richard." With trembling fingers, Karen unwrapped the small package. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny umbrella, a reminder of their first meeting in the rain. The symbolism wasn't lost. On her, that umbrella represented protection, but also the storm that had changed the course of her life. As she walked through the beautiful apartment, clearly chosen with her taste in mind, and finally stood before the magnificent view of the city, Karen felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with rejection and humiliation had led her here, to this moment of profound transformation. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, the small umbrella charm catching the light. Whatever she decided about Hayes Publishing, about Richard, about her future, one thing was certain: she would never again allow anyone else to determine her worth. That knowledge, hard-won through pain and persistence, was the most valuable gift of all. 6 months after being left at the altar, Karen Walsh stood at the beginning of a new chapter, ready to write her own story on her own terms. And somewhere, in the city below, Dennis was living with the consequences of his cruelty, watching the woman he had rejected rise beyond his reach, transformed not by revenge, but by the simple power of believing in herself. Dawn found Karen still awake, sitting by the window of her new apartment, watching the city come to life as she considered her options. The online launch of Gleam had gone live at midnight to immediate positive response. Her phone had been buzzing, with congratulatory messages from the team and early feedback from industry insiders. It was everything they had hoped for and more. Yet Karen's mind was on Richard's note, on the elegant bracelet around her wrist, on the choice that lay before her. Hayes Publishing offered an incredible opportunity: more prestige, more creative control, a fresh start in a new environment. Staying at Harrington Media meant continuing what she'd begun, working with a team she'd come to respect, and Richard. The truth she'd been avoiding confronted her now in the clear light of morning. Her feelings for Richard had grown beyond professional admiration or gratitude. There was a connection between them that defied simple categorization, not just mentor and protégé, not quite friends, but something with the potential to be more. Was that potential worth exploring? Or would it be wiser to accept Eleanor Hayes' offer, to continue her professional growth without the complication of feelings for the man who had given her this second chance? By the time Karen showered and dressed for work, she had made her decision. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same courage and authenticity that had brought her this far. The Harrington Media offices were buzzing with excitement when she arrived. Staff members stopped to congratulate her as she made her way to her office, where a mountain of emails awaited her attention. The first hours of the morning were a whirlwind of response to the launch, addressing minor website issues, coordinating with the PR team on press inquiries, reviewing early sales figures from digital subscriptions. It was nearly noon when Richard appeared in her doorway. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his expression carefully neutral. Karen nodded, suddenly nervous. "Of course." "Let's walk," he suggested. "You could probably use some fresh air after the night you've had." They took the elevator to the ground floor in comfortable silence, then stepped out into the mild spring day. The park across from the Harrington building offered a quiet path where they could talk without interruption. "The launch is exceeding. How are projections?" Richard said as they walked. "You've accomplished something remarkable, Karen." "We all did," she corrected gently. "It was a team effort." Richard smiled, acknowledging her point. "True, but teams need leaders, and you stepped into that role more effectively than anyone could have anticipated." He paused, then continued, more carefully. "Have you had a chance to consider the Hayes Publishing offer?" Karen stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "I have. And before I tell you my decision, I need to ask you something." Richard met her gaze steadily. "Anything. When you found me that day, crying in the rain, humiliated, at the lowest point of my life, was I just another of your projects? Another talented person in unfortunate circumstances for you to rescue?" The question clearly surprised him. "Is that what you think?" "I don't know what to think," Karen admitted. "Diana mentioned your habit of finding people with potential and giving them chances. Was I just another one of those?" Richard was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "It's true that I've made a practice of looking beyond conventional credentials to find talent, but with you—" He hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic openness. With you, it was different from the beginning. There was something about your dignity in that moment of humiliation, something in your eyes that spoke of a strength you didn't know you possessed. I was drawn to you in a way I hadn't anticipated, and that hasn't diminished as we've worked together. Karen's heart quickened at his words. So when you recommended me for the Hayes position, I was trying to do the right thing, Richard admitted, to give you the opportunity you deserve, without allowing my personal feelings to influence your career path. He smiled ruefully. Apparently I didn't succeed in keeping those feelings entirely hidden. No, Karen agreed softly. You didn't. They stood facing each other in the dappled sunlight of the park, the moment stretching between them with possibility. So, Richard said finally, Hayes Publishing? Karen took a deep breath. I'm declining their offer. Surprise flickered across Richard's face, followed by something that looked very much like hope. May I ask why? Because my work at Harrington Media isn't finished yet, Karen said simply. The Gleam relaunch is just the beginning. I have other ideas, other projects I want to pursue. She paused, gathering her courage, and because there are some relationships worth exploring, even if they're complicated. Richard's smile transformed his serious face, making him look younger, almost boyish in his happiness. Are you sure? I don't want you to make this decision. I'm making this decision based on what I want, Karen interrupted gently. That's something I've learned these past months. My value doesn't come from others' approval. My choices don't need to be justified to anyone but myself. Richard nodded, respecting her assertion. So what happens now? Now, Karen said, smiling, we go back to work. We build on what we've accomplished with Gleam. We continue as colleagues, getting to know each other better outside the office, seeing where this connection between us might lead without rushing or assuming. That sounds very sensible, Richard observed, though his eyes held a warmth that belied his businesslike tone. I've become a very sensible person, Karen agreed with a small laugh, one of many changes these past months have brought. As they turned to walk back to the office, Richard hesitated, then offered his hand. Karen took it, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that was both simple and profound. In that moment, she thought of Dennis, of his cruel rejection that had set this journey in motion. Once she had believed his approval defined her worth. Now she understood that her value had been within her all along, waiting to be recognized, first by Richard, then by her colleagues, and finally, most importantly, by herself. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with professional challenges and personal possibilities, but Karen faced it without fear, knowing that she had found her authentic voice, her true strength. Whatever came next, in her career, in her relationship with Richard, in all aspects of her life, she would meet it as her full, imperfect, magnificent self, and that she knew was the greatest transformation of all.